My first question is this one. There seems to be some kind of magic that pushes people to take trips walking. So I know you've been asked so many times,
Yeah.
but why walking?
Well, the basic thing is I just like the motion. I like the movement of it. I like the cadence of having a gait that just rolls on for mile after mile, day after day, month after month eventually. I think there's a very fundamental feeling of satisfaction and accomplishment when you bring yourself under your own power, over a mountain range or across a desert or over some plain that you couldn't see the end of when you started, and you see what's on the other side, and you feel like you've earned sort of the right to inhabit that place. I belong to this place now in some way, and it's a good feeling. I've moved around a lot and have gotten really used to sort of feeling of dislocation of trying to set up my life again in a new community. So this feeling that I get when I am traveling this way of knowing very intimately every step of the journey is tremendously valuable to me.
And why did you decide to take this trip in Europe?
I had
and also, if I may ask something, why did you choose? Is there any particular reason why you chose to leave from Istanbul and to get to Edinburgh?
Yeah. Let's see. So when I was growing up, I was often reading stories of people who'd gone on great journeys. So I had this idea that every once in a while you needed to go off and go on a grand adventure. And this was part of what made life worth living. And when I had gotten out of school, I was living in Seattle at the time and was very unhappy. I decided the best thing I could do would be to walk across the continent. I'd not gone for any trip longer than roughly 200 miles or a few weeks before, so it was a huge step forward and just expanding the scale of what I was trying to do. And I'd had a very Eurocentric education. It was very focused on European history, European culture, European literature, but I'd never been to Europe before. And as I was thinking, and this all went through my head very quickly, that if I was going to walk across a continent for the first time, it should probably be Europe, because it was the continent I was most familiar with, at least sort of in an abstract sense. And it's also unique among the places that are given the courtesy of being called continents in that it doesn't actually have a desert in the middle of it. Because it is such an odd piece of land with such a heavily indented coastline, you're never far from the sea, so you don't have these huge arid basins in the middle or high plateaus that every other continent has, and every other continent is much harder to walk across as a result. So I said, all right, this was probably in the winter of 2010, 2011, and I started looking at the map of Europe and decided that if I wanted to travel, I didn't want to be traveling out in the winter, exposed, cold, more vulnerable to things like hypothermia, even frostbite maybe. So I said, I'll start in the spring, and if I'm going all the way across the continent from one side to the other, from salt water to salt water, I'll have to go over the Continental Divide in the Alps at some point, so I'll try to make that be at the peak of summer, when the snow will have melted enough that I can get over the passes. So instead of it being going around the Alps or staying to the valleys, I'll go right over the Alps. And then I'll try to finish before winter sets in again. And I knew that I definitely wanted to see the Balkans very much. I wanted to see Istanbul quite a lot, and had tried to find a way of moving there at one point, even when I was slightly younger. And I knew I wanted to get to the UK at the end. I'd been trying to figure out a way of moving to Scotland also for quite some time, but it had never been possible. I thought if there's one place on Earth that would be worth walking all the way across the continent to get to, I thought Edinburgh was probably it. I thought that would be a tremendous place to finish. So I just drew a straight line across the map of Europe and said, I like everything on this line between Istanbul and Edinburgh, and I like everything that varies from that line a little bit. So if I have to work my route around it for one reason or another, there's nothing on this route that will disappoint me or seem to be a waste of my time. And it's just the right length that I can start in spring in the Balkans, reach the high part of the Alps in the middle of summer, and then finish in Scotland in the fall. And I also think I have just enough money saved to pull it off. So I essentially said it's now or never. I told my family what I was planning on doing. They were appalled. I got a plane ticket, and in March, I dropped into the Istanbul airport with really hardly any clue what I was doing. they misplaced my luggage, or they even confiscated it, I think, to search through it. So I didn't have my tent or hardly any of my equipment when I got to the airport. And at that point, I was committed. There was no question in my mind that I was going to do anything but push all the way through until it was done.
Did you have any doubts before?
I was unhappy enough in Seattle that there was no doubt that was adequate to stop me. This was right after the economic crash had globally set in full force, and there were just a ton of people about my age, early to mid-20s, in Seattle at that point, who were having a slightly hard time figuring out how to pursue what they wanted in life, given that the society that they just emerged into or just moved into didn't have a whole lot of use for them. So I was kind of biding my time in a desperate fashion until I figured out what I could do next and how I could extricate myself from the situation. And once
How old are you now? Sorry if I interrupt.
I'm 27 now, and I turned 24 when I was in Switzerland. So right toward the middle of the trip, yeah, I turned 24. It was kind of interesting because people would often ask me how old I was when I crossed paths with them. I would be out in some countryside in some country somewhere, and if someone else was walking the other direction, they'd often ask where I was from and how old I was. And even when there was a language barrier, and there often was a language barrier, it was entirely my fault. I was trying to do my best to learn the necessary phrases to get around, but I could only do so much in a hurry. But they were always sort of surprised to find out how old I was, and I was never entirely sure why. It was very different from when I walked across the United States. When I walked across Europe, everyone reacted to me as a young man who was going out to see the world, and that was a positive thing. And then when I walked across the United States, only 2 years later, people treated me completely differently. It was like I'd suddenly become middle-aged, in effect.
Really?
And people were asking me things like, "Oh, why aren't you at home taking care of your family? What about your children?" I don't have children. There's quite a shift. I think in the 60s and 70s, there was sort of a backpacking boom in the U.S. that has declined. It's not so much a part of the culture now as it was then, but during the sort of high watermark of the countercultural movement, this idea of going off on a road trip, either by bicycle or on foot or in some beat-up old car, just to find out what the real country was something that a lot of people were interested in. It definitely was in vogue for a while.
It's kind of Kerouac in the end, isn't it?
Yeah.
Even though it didn't work. Yeah.
Well, here's part of the other reason why I don't seek out books like that. I can't stand on the road.
Because there is this page actually that I wanted to read to you. Tell me what you think about it. You know that Mark Twain did exactly what you did, except he did it from Germany, like towards Italy, I guess. Yeah. Huh. And there is this book that he wrote. It's called A Tramp Abroad. And basically, the first thing that he says is, in the introduction, one day it occurred to me, I don't have my glasses, that it had been many years since the world had been afforded the spectacle of a man adventurous enough to undertake a journey through Europe on foot. After much thought, I decided that I was a person fitted to furnish to mankind this spectacle. So I determined to do it. This was in March 1878.
Yeah.
But you were telling me before, you were in Seattle, you were going to do something like to change.
Before I lived in Seattle, I was always trying to take charge of what I was doing in a very aggressive way. And when I got to Seattle, I had a fairly trying year previous to that. It included, I wound up with bilateral pneumonia at one point, hospitalized on oxygen. And coming out of that episode, which had sort of disrupted a whole bunch of plans that I'd had, I decided I was going to take some time and just help other people with what they were doing. So I was trying to get involved with local theatrical productions. I was involved with some nonprofits. I was doing a lot of volunteer type things. But none of them felt stable. It never wound up feeling like I was part of a family doing that. Partially because there was a lot of really high turnover in Seattle at that point. People moved, people left, people would come into jobs and then would disappear. Living with people who were constantly in motion. I was living in a house with 10 different people. I wanted to feel again like I was in in some sort of control of my destiny. So walking was the simplest and most effective way of taking hold of that.
Have you ever actually thought, after all these savings of money, well, yes, I've done all this work to project it, but maybe next time?
Do you mean beforehand, during it, or afterward?
Beforehand.
Never beforehand, no.
What do you mean afterwards?
Well, one of the things that is, at least on the two trips that I've done, that has been becoming more apparent is that I've not done things that many other people do, and have not experienced things that many other people experience, because I have committed myself to doing these particular things by myself. And that's something that I did not feel at all before I walked across Europe. In that case, I was entirely certain of what I was doing before I did it. I had only one moment of fatigue and doubt, really, on that walk across Europe. And that was in northern England. It was just a day of punishingly bad weather, some of the worst weather I've ever been in, and the visibility had dropped. So in that afternoon, it was a horizontal hailstorm with gale force winds just beating into my face, and there was nothing I could do about it for hours and hours. And I couldn't see anything. It was just gray. And I thought, this is totally pointless. Because by this, I've been through a lot of bad weather in bad conditions in different places, and it all started to seem the same. It was just this uniform, indistinguished murk that was loud and brutal and difficult. And in that moment, I couldn't really remember exactly why I was still walking. I didn't regret going on the trip, but for a moment, I wasn't sure why I was still traveling onward. I'd seen so much and come so far, and I didn't understand how things could improve. Of course, over the next couple of months, I got into Scotland and was as happy as I've ever been to be there. And that experience of knowing that there you can have this one afternoon that's just wretched, but that does not need to define, that does not have to set the boundary of what you can know and where you can go and what you will feel, that if you push through, there's another mountainside, there is another sunset, there is another ocean. That was worth learning in that manner.
So do you think, oh, let me get this straight. Like, when you said that basically you didn't have cold feet, but you've kind of regretted it just for one day when you were in England?
When I was
and you said that you were...
No, I didn't regret it, but if you're saying cold feet, in that moment, I didn't know if I wanted to just stop. Right? There's always the possibility, so long as you're anywhere, near a bus stop or whatever, you can just stop. It wasn't like I was in the middle of the Gobi Desert where I had to get myself out of it. It wasn't like I was Shackleton stranded on an island off the coast of Antarctica. If I wanted to just quit, I could quit. And that was the only moment in the entire trip when the thought of stopping ever crossed my mind. Because otherwise it was the most wonderful experience I'd ever had. Every day was tremendous. Even if
what I find strange?
Huh?
There is one thing that I found strange. Well, first I didn't expect that. I didn't expect you saying that. But now that you're telling me, there is another guy, I don't know if you ever heard about him, it's called Christoph Rehage. He's a German guy.
Yeah, I've corresponded with him.
Have you?
I wish I knew him. I wish I knew him better. He seems like a terrific person.
One thing that I remember reading about him is that, well, as you know, he decided to travel back to Germany from China walking.
Yeah.
But then at some point he just gave up, because he understood that the same reasons that brought him to decide, I don't want to do this because I'm forced, I don't want to take trains and planes because I'm forced,
right.
So I have to walk.
Right.
Those same reasons made him feel like he was forced to walk, which is why he decided to take planes to get back home.
Well, I saw his video about walking across China on YouTube before I decided to walk across Europe, and it made a big impression on me. I realized I didn't want to hit whatever it was he hit. And for all that what he did and what he gained from his experience seems to be archetypically perfect, almost in a certain way. That was a great journey that he went on. It wasn't the journey that I wanted.
Do you mean because he walked in a desert?
No, no, not at all. I mean the feeling that he had become trapped. What you were just describing.
All right.
The notion that he'd gone on the journey to become free, and instead he'd become trapped, and he realized it, so he changed. The fact that he realized it and changed gives that story, the way he tells it, in that very simple form, power. But I'd already done enough traveling on my own or in difficult places to know that that was not an experience that I wanted to walk into myself blindly if I could avoid it. Because it was clear from the way he tells that story, at least in that video, that it hurt.
Yeah. But yeah, there was one other thing that I wanted to ask you. Considering, since there seemed to be such an introspective thing in walking, did you ever get any proposal from one of your friends to walk with you?
Yeah, once. But it was a friend of mine who I had gone on a hike with, but the hike had not gone quite well. And the key moment there was, we were in New Zealand, and we'd gone up one of the ranges in Otago, and there was a stream that had formed a slight cataract cutting down between boulders. So in order to pass the stream, you had to jump across. And she was uncertain, so I jumped across. It was fine. The footing was good. There was no real hazard. She didn't come over, so I jumped back across, and I said, well, if it's because of the backpack, if you're worried that the backpack will throw you off or weigh you down and make it harder to jump, I can take your backpack across. So I did that. And then she was still hesitant. And practically, that said something. But also, on a symbolic level, there was too much going on there. And so when she suggested that she walk across Europe with me, what she said was, but you do know that we won't walk the whole way. And I said, I am walking the whole way. And that was as far as that went.
Somebody, you said no. That's what you answered to a friend of yours. You just said...
I don't think I said no. I think I just said, I am walking all the way. It was not negotiable in any regard.
Oh my god, yeah. That was already a compromise. You said yeah.
Right, well,
you didn't want to walk the
partially
whole way.
because during the trip and afterward, I've always had to explain to people how I got across the English Channel. Right? Everyone says, you can't walk across the English Channel, and that's true. Even though in France, several people told me that it was legal. People in villages near the channel were telling me that it was legal to try to walk through the Channel Tunnel. Oh no. But even there, like I paced the observation deck of the ferry the whole way across the channel just so I could say that I didn't stop walking. I did my very best. And that was the only time where I couldn't actually make my own way on land.
Well, but you stopped walking at some point, didn't you? Because I
Right.
have your letters in front of you. It seems like you took some kind of a touristic break.
Right.
To visit Prague, Berlin, and Vienna, if I don't get
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, yeah.
Right, so what it was that I'd never been to Europe before, right? And I knew from my diagonal route across the continent that there were places that I would really love to see that I wasn't going to be able to include on foot. It was just too far in a perpendicular direction. So I also knew that when I got halfway, I wanted to sort of interrupt things for a moment. So what I did was, the first town that I got to in Austria was Villach. And from there I said, right, I'm taking a vacation. And I traveled by train and by bus to Vienna and Prague and Berlin. And then I came back again, and from that train station, I kept walking again. So the chain of footprints was unbroken. And actually, the funny thing about this vacation was, okay, why did I go to Vienna? I went to Vienna because of the Before movies, Before Sunrise, Before Sunset. It was a pilgrimage. It wasn't the Santiago pilgrimage, but it was a small personal pilgrimage, and it was a total bust, which is actually kind of classic to those movies if you know what they're like. The idea that you go there on a pilgrimage and it just doesn't pan out the way you expect at all. From there, I went to Prague. I loved Prague. I would happily go back to Prague in a moment. And in Berlin, I realized I was actually homesick for walking. It was,
Really?
yeah, it was the strangest feeling. I got there and there was hardly any room in any hostels in Berlin for some reason that day when I arrived. So I managed to find a place to stay for 2 nights. 2 nights. That's and I went to an art museum, and the art museum had a land art exhibit. That was the main thing on display. Are you familiar with land art?
No.
The idea,
Unfortunately not.
it was a big deal in the 70s, and the notion was people would go and walk in a straight line across the countryside doing things like taking a photograph every 10 meters. And in
Wow.
the 70s, this was considered to be radical, cutting edge, you know, daring artistic expression. And I'm roaming through this museum feeling almost seasick. And I just realized I needed to leave. I needed to get back to what I was doing. So I turned around, went back to Prague, went back to Vienna, got back off in Austria, and arrived in the middle of the night. It was so late that there was no way I was going to place to sleep. So I looked at my maps and figured out where I could find a forest on the edge of town. Got there, found the place where I was going to hide in the woods, set up my tent, and it was beautiful. I was back where I belonged again. You know?
Have you ever felt unsafe? Because there is one point, actually, it's your first letter that you wrote from Istanbul. You described this neighborhood as the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
Which is the place where you were walking through.
I was incredibly sleep deprived, for one thing. I'd been just racing furiously to get everything arranged to go and get on the plane in Seattle to fly to Turkey, and had not slept very much in several days. So when I got to the airport and they said that they'd withheld my luggage, that it was detained, I didn't really have a map of where I was trying to go in Istanbul. I just had made a sketch, like a few lines with a pen on a blank piece of paper to try to indicate where to go. And I got off the bus in Taksim in Istanbul, and it was dark, pitch dark, with heavy sleet falling, and it felt like I just emerged into. It was like being in the inside of a garbage disposal unit in a sink, almost. Just the noise, the motion, the feeling of frenzy, not knowing how anything was organized, having a hard time even telling which direction was which. So many people. The vehicles not stopping for people trying to cross the road. And then it turned out, I realized that in order to get where I was going, I had to leave the main street and go into a 19th century ghetto area. And I couldn't find street signs. I was trying to show the scrap of paper to people so I could get my directions. And then this boy sort of attached himself to me, and he took my piece of paper and started leading me in circles deeper and deeper into the ghetto. And he would go up steps and knock on doors, and people would come out and not want to open the door for him, and he would talk to them and point at me, and then they would close the door, and then he'd come back down and sort of take me and say, no, it's this way, it's this way. And meanwhile, I didn't have nearly enough basic Turkish to be able to really understand what was going on. And it rapidly became clear that he was up to no good. And as soon as I realized that, I grabbed the map back and started running. He grabbed onto my backpack from behind, so I was kind of dragging him for a moment, and he was shouting at me. He dropped off. So then I started over. I got back to the main street. I kind of like burst out of this alleyway back into the main thoroughfare on Tarlabaşı, and started over. I got lost. I wound up at a hotel, that part of Istanbul is famous for transvestite hotels. Okay. And so I wound up in the lobby, and the security guard let me use the phone. And I called the person I was trying to actually get through to the entire time, and turned out that I was just around the corner the whole time. I was so close, but I just missed it every time in the dark, so it all turned out well. And I eventually got my luggage back too, so...
Was this the only time that you met somebody who was up to no good?
No, definitely not. It didn't... Then the other thing was, it was a teenager who... You know, he wasn't pulling weapons on me or anything. He was just trying to figure out as he went how he could try to get some money off of me one way or another. The most dangerous people are always police, if not military. because anyone else you can just leave, right? But once somebody is in uniform, if they detain you, you can't leave. And it's very difficult to resist or argue with somebody who has officially the right to restrain you. You get to be very confident of your read of people. You know, if so much of your interaction is immediate, and you've never met somebody before, and things can really depend on who this person is and how you communicate with them, even if, you know, if there's a language barrier, you have to put a lot of faith in how you perceive somebody. And it's not just that, you know, you meet bad people potentially. The people who I met who were just tremendous human beings, who made the trip in many ways what it was, strange bright sparks and deep waters and all those kind of people, they were everywhere. And I wouldn't have met these people if I hadn't put myself in this position of insecurity and risk. So it's all part of it.
When I was walking in Spain, I met a lot of people, but really a lot of people who had so many stories to tell, so many. And after a while, you cannot even tell them, all right, so if you just tell me your name and your last name, I can add you on Facebook, because they didn't have Facebook.
Yeah.
For example, I met 3 guys, I don't know how you, like, building workers, I don't know how you call them, builders.
Yeah.
And they were all from the same part of Navarra, and I had the best conversations with them. And they also wrote me a poem, actually. So I always think of them really fondly.
Yeah.
So have you ever met them? Have you ever met somebody like them?
There are several. So one of them was in Western Bulgaria. This was maybe the first one who stands out kind of in that way. There was a man who was the only other person on this long stretch of country road, and we crossed paths and we were having a conversation, and I wasn't very comfortable. He was wearing a blue kind of mechanic suit that was really disheveled, and he was missing a lot of teeth. And didn't look. He was fairly elderly, and I wasn't sure exactly what was going on. He was very animated and very trying to engage me in conversation. He had this dog with him who was kind of ferreting around me, so I was like, watching the dog, watching the man, and he sort of said, "You'll wait here," more or less. Like, he was trying to convey very earnestly this idea that I was gonna stay here and I was gonna wait for him, and then he hurried off. And I watched him go, and I was thinking, I don't know what's going on here. And I had a weird day already. I'd just been meeting very peculiar people. So I thought, look, if I don't get a good feeling, trust that feeling that this is not quite right, and keep moving. So I hauled off, and I wasn't trying to get away as fast as I could, but I just figured he wasn't going to take the trouble to catch up with me. And then when I looked back, he was running after me he was chasing after me down the road with his dog and shouting at me to stop. And when he caught up to me, he was just distraught. He was out of breath, red in the face, and he held out his hands, and he had Easter eggs, dyed Eastern European Slavic Easter eggs. It was Easter. And he gave them to me, and then he blessed me. Sort of like, with his hand on my forehead, and like summoning all the beneficent influences of the countryside and whatever to protect me on my journey, and praying for me more or less, and then let me go on my way. And
this is Bulgaria.
Yeah, this was in northwestern Bulgaria. It was one of these things where you feel I've done nothing to deserve such kindness, and yet here it is, and it's not something that leaves you. This feeling that somewhere out there is this goodwill that abides, in people.
Right.
So that was one.
Like, I guess you spent a lot of time alone while you were working, didn't you?
Well, it's kind of funny. in Europe, you're never very far away from another person. I don't know if you can always see something. If you can't actually see another person, you can at least see a car that someone is driving. You can see a house, and you can imagine that there's somebody in the house. Or beyond that, you can see a power line, or a fence, or a road, something that somebody has left there. Otherwise, the kind of loneliness that I did feel, it was always when I just left somewhere that I'd stayed for a little bit. Because the way it worked was I would travel. I sort of had a week and a weekend, and a week and a weekend structure, where every few days I'd stop for a bit somewhere. You know, I needed to wash my clothes, I needed to plan where I was going for the next few weeks, I wanted to get in touch with people to tell them how I was doing and let them know I was still all right. And sometimes in these stops, I got to actually stay with people. So the first one was when I left Sofia in Bulgaria. I'd stayed with some people for about a week. And the first day back on the road was very lonely. Not because I felt... It wasn't anything that was actually very particular to my circumstances. It was more that I had seen people suddenly who were very close with each other. And it made me realize that I was just not close with anybody. My circumstances were no different, but it's just that I'd seen people who were so happy in each other's company. And I wasn't unhappy by myself. I just realized that that was a sort of happiness that was not there for me to have. And that sort of feeling did recur every once in a while through the trip. If I met people who I really felt like I connected with, or I appreciated something about their life, the moment of leaving was always difficult.
Do you think this is just particular to your experience? Or, for example, if you should recommend to anybody else the project of walking from one place to the other, you will tell him that he should expect moments like this?
I think you should definitely expect moments that aren't pure enthusiasm. And there are many different kinds of that.
Because, I mean, like, you can say that walking brings you to some kind of feeling of communion with what you have around you. But you're also saying that it can bring you to have feelings of, is that how you say, estrangement in English?
Yeah. Yeah, but it wasn't...
You know why I'm asking you, if you want? Like, I just clarify my question, because, you know, when you watch a video to get an idea what that person was thinking about while, well, basically he or she was doing it, there's one sequence that really left me in doubt, because I didn't know what you meant by then, looking at the camera, and I'm not really able to see if you're doing that, like if you have that face because you're extremely sad or extremely tired.
Is it when I'm in the tent?
Yeah.
That was an interesting night. I was hiding on a military training ground. It was not a place where I was supposed to be. And it was... You can see that I'm in my sleeping bag wearing my rain jacket. Now that's never a good sign. By that point, I'd been going through the mountains, right through the heart of the mountains, over and over and over for weeks. And I was getting very strong, but I was also getting very thin. Because when you're traveling like that, you're burning twice as much energy as a normal sedentary person would. And I was coming close to just kind of being very gaunt, not just physically, but sort of like emotionally. Like everything was getting really stretched and sinewy. So that day, I didn't have a whole lot left in me at the moment, and I crawled into my tent, knowing that if anyone found me, I'd get into huge trouble. It was another moment where I think I'd just passed previously in the day another group of hikers. In this case, it was the main thing was two brothers who were, I think, in their 60s and had spent their lives traveling the world as climbers. I think they'd done noteworthy things in the Himalayas, and had lived very full lives. And now, in their advancing age, they were still together and still taking on the world. So I meet them, and then I go off into this place where I'm not supposed to be, and I'm exhausted. So it seemed like a moment that was worth noting in case, you know, everything, every moment had a color to it, and that moment had its own color. That if I wanted to make a video that said this was what the trip was like, that was a kind of feeling that I felt like I should include. Most of the trip wasn't like that. Sometimes it was.
So actually, while you were taking this walk, have you ever thought about what you were missing while you were walking?
No. No.
See, because that would...
Not at all. You don't do something like this unless it is the most important thing, right? This when I was saying it didn't ever impress me that at any moment I could have stopped. Once I said I was going in my mind, I'm going to do this. It was kind of a big deal when the first time I told someone else that I was going to do it. I think it was actually a coworker of mine at the time. I said, you know, I'm going to do this. Once I had the thought, and then once I shared it, it was going to happen, and nothing else.
So, like, what were the reactions of the people around you? Because you mentioned that you told your parents.
Yeah,
now you're saying that you're...
They were very silent. They didn't like it. So first it was just silence. They just didn't respond. And then they were worried that because I was going through Serbia, I planned to go through Serbia, they were afraid that in Serbia there would be a lot of anti-American sentiment and that someone would try to hurt me. And that didn't happen. It never even seemed likely that that would happen. There was one person in Serbia who shouted at me for being an American, but then all the other men that he was with said, hey, hey, hey. So it was no problem.
Oh my God. Have you ever been afraid of that? Have you ever been influenced by people and being brought to think that you would have any problem because you were American?
Well, like right now I'm trying to figure out how I could walk across Asia. And if I can walk across Asia, then I can say that I've walked around the world, which I would like. I would like to see the world while walking around it. Oh, Gunther. I would like to walk across Asia so that I could walk around the world, because I would like that to be something that I do in my life. And as an American, walking across Asia right now is not bureaucratically possible. The borders do not allow it. There were times on the trip across Europe where I could have gotten into huge trouble if I was not American. I felt that. But it was only with police. I got pulled over by police so often in the Balkans, and every time the American passport suddenly changed the entire dynamic. Because people often thought that I was either a smuggler or a refugee. I was clearly not a normal tourist. I was in places where tourists don't go because they're not famous places, and I was clearly carrying a lot of stuff. I had this big backpack, and I had my spare shirt wrapped around my head. So I was repeatedly mistaken for being from somewhere in Western or Central Asia. People assumed that I was a refugee or was smuggling drugs in my backpack or something, which was not the case. So when the police come at you and then you suddenly produce this shiny American passport, it's like I was like, so in that sense I was very lucky. Yeah.
There is one thing that really puzzles me. I remember about reading that you basically spent one night in a place where your tent got soaked in water.
That happened a few times, yeah.
What's normally the feeling that you have when you feel so aggressed, assaulted by the weather around you?
Yeah.
Because if there's one thing bad thing that I can think about is being cold and wet at night.
Yeah.
How did you get through these feelings?
Well, let's just go over the two times that come first to my mind. The first one was actually the end of the first full day that I spent out on the road in Turkey. My first full day out of Istanbul ended with me in the pouring rain with my tent leaking, surrounded by wild dogs howling at me. And then my tent kind of sagged as it got wet, because when the material gets saturated, it goes all limp. So it sort of collapses in on you in the tent. and it's like pressed up against your face, and there's water coming up through the floor, and it's like, this is the tent that I was going to travel across the continent with, and it's already broken? How did this happen? And by that point, I'd walked more than 50 kilometers that day. And I'd been dealing with dogs all day, fending off dogs that were trying to attack me. And it was sort of like, I give up. I'm not going to be worried about this. I'll deal with this in the morning. Right now, I cannot make this situation better. It is what it is. So you just switch off the lights and you wake up in the morning and keep going. That was how I remember that episode. With the second time, it was in Bulgaria. I was up in the snow on the highest mountain in that range, and I wanted to get close to the top because I wanted to try to get to the top the next day, but I had to stay low so it would be safer. And the weather on that mountain is so ferocious that they have some emergency shelters built into the mountainside, right? And they were scary. There was nothing wrong with them. They just felt bad. It's like, I don't want to be in this room. I don't want to be in this place with no windows and the trash everywhere and just the feeling of wrongness. So instead I decided that I was going to set up my tent in the snow. And unfortunately, my body heat melted all of the snow beneath the tent during the night. So in the middle of the night, again, the water came welling up through the floor of the tent, only now it was ice water. And there was a very strong wind blowing that just picked up through the night and then kept picking up all through the rest day until it was hurricane force. So in the middle of the night, I realized that I couldn't stay in the tent because it was filling up with water from below. And if I got out of the tent might blow away, even with all of my other equipment in it. So after I had some bags of breakfast cereal. So I piled those up on the floor for a moment to make a little heap, like sandbags, sat on those for a second, just trying to figure out what was I going to do. And I thought, well, okay, my sleeping bag is sort of wet, but it's not completely out of commission. It's not really that cold at night. So I got out of the tent, took the tent down, put rocks on top of it to keep it from blowing away, bundled up my sleeping bag in my arms, went to the door of one of these emergency shelters that I was near. And the shelter had snow that had filled up in it as well. So I said, I'm not going to go inside, but I need to be out of the wind. So I just sat down in the door of the shelter and wrapped my sleeping bag around me, and I just sat there all night. And I just watched the night go by, and then, eventually the sun started to come up, and there were lights down, and there were villages way, way below in the valley. So you see the lights going on as people start their day, and eventually the sun is clear and the sky lightens up, so you stand up, and my tent was still there and it hadn't blown away, so I packed up my stuff and kept going up the mountain. And then things got really crazy, so it was just one of those days, you know?
I don't know, I wonder what I would have done in your shoes. But your choices are clear. You stay in the tent and you get really wet. You go sit in the doorway and you just wait. You just wait for the sun to come back up. It's going to take 6 or 7 hours. You just sit there and wait, or you try to go back down the mountain in the dark and risk twisting your ankle on a rock or a tree root or something. Like when we were talking about the feeling of estrangement, I think this is the flip side. Maybe like is this when you really get some communion with like things around you?
It's what
yeah. Like, I guess you must have been really, like, scared while you were, or at least while you were considering that your tent might actually blow away.
No.
But what did
actually,
you feel by then?
One of the things that happens for me when I go on this trip is the moment that I step out the door at the very beginning, my capacity for surprise disappears. It's sort of like when you go to watch a movie, you suspend your disbelief, right? You're just in the world of the story, and so long as the story is good, you're part of it, right? And that's how these trips have felt for me. Going up to the trip, it's just chaos and nothing is working, but as soon as I'm fully loaded and I step out the door, everything that happens is the correct thing. And then you're just dealing with everything. You can't react by getting afraid. That doesn't help you at all. But when it comes to the sort of communion thing of what that feels like, definitely the night on Botev was like that. And I couldn't have had that feeling if I hadn't put myself in that very awkward place. It was just an awkward situation all around, but deeply and uniquely beautiful. And there are very few people who I've met who make a point of doing that to themselves. When these moments come along that do glimmer and have this hard, bright radiance to them, you know that's it all depends on that. Those moments have to make everything else worth it. So you can't push it, but you have to keep putting yourself in this position where it can happen over and over again. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you are just cold and miserable. But when you get these times when everything suddenly includes you, that's the ideal. And it does happen.
So how do you think this changed you, if it did? Or at least, like, I think what I mean is, I guess when you left, you must have said, all right, this is me now.
Yeah.
At some point, unless something bad happens, I will have done it.
Yeah.
And I will be a different person. So how did you expect your life to be once you did it?
I didn't go into it thinking that I was going to develop as a person. I didn't think I was going to have some sort of revelatory episode of growth. And I know that that's part of the standard story of something like this, is that you go out there because you're coming from a time of trouble and turmoil in your heart, and you want to cleanse yourself or free yourself. And stories like that are very popular and sell very well. But that wasn't what I expected. When I'm saying that when you do something like this, it's because it matters the most. That can either be because you know it's the perfect thing for you, or it can be because nothing else really counts. And I think I had a little bit of both of those things going. So over the course of the trip, as I realized that I was very, very much in my element doing this, and had never felt so strong or so capable or so content with my circumstances, it did make me think that it was worth trying to learn from the experience and keep going with it in some way, which is eventually what led to me walking across the United States. At the end of the trip, I met someone who wanted me around. So I packed up my backpack one last time and started walking east. And that night, I wound up hiding in some trees by a reservoir, and it snowed. Snowed heavily. In the morning, I woke up and everything was buried, and packed everything up, got out of the forest, walked into Edinburgh in the night in the snow, and then in the morning, there it was over. At that moment, when the video stops, it was done. That was the split second of it all being finished. And I was so confused. We were going to travel back to Glasgow by train, and on the train ride back, I was paranoid. I had to put my backpack in a luggage rack at the other end of the compartment on the train, and I was so worried that someone was going to steal it, because for the previous 9 months, that backpack had never left me. You know? Everything that I'd carried so far was in that backpack on the other end of that train. And I felt so vulnerable. But you know, we held it together, got back to Glasgow, and I started getting my life back together again. So.
Do you think something in this trip changed the way you relate to people now?
Yeah.
I mean, having to look so much inside yourself, how does that bring you to behave?
I don't know if it was so much looking inside myself as it was kind of the first time in my life that I was meeting people just as one person meets another person. I wasn't meeting them as a son or a brother or a coworker or a classmate or a student. It was just me and them. You know, on the side of a road somewhere in France, or somewhere in Germany, or somewhere in Austria, or in Turkey, or in Bulgaria, or in Serbia, or in Croatia, or in Slovenia, or in Wales. You know, it's just there was a certain coming of age quality to it in that regard. But when it was over, the main thing was that I'd gone from being this traveling object to then saying I belong with someone, and that set the course of the next couple of years of my life. Everything that I felt like I'd gained walking across Europe, I lost walking across the United States. Why is
that?
If in the whole course of the trip across Europe, I was unknowingly going from a place where I didn't belong to a place where I was wanted, then the trip across the United States went in the exact opposite direction.
So I have one last question for you.
Sure.
Where are you at right now?
I'm currently in Honolulu, Hawaii, and I'm planning what will hopefully be the next trip. And if all goes well, I'll be in India in about a month.
Oh my God, walking.
It'll be a short walk this time, but
right.
We'll see what happens. I've never been, so this will be an experiment.
Actually, if you think about it, I was, as you did exactly the same. Like I was walking for 50 kilometers a day.
Yeah.
It's something that normally people would consider really hard, really hard. Not because it is hard, just because it's something that's really far away from how people think about things, you know. But I was there was nothing to be anxious about, and I thought, all right, so if I go back to wherever I will have to move, I know that there will be one moment in which I will say to myself, see, you're falling exactly into the same old bad habits. So what is the sense? And I thought, well, right now I'm feeling really happy. I know that life has been really kind to me, and I will go again into really good times, but I will also have bad times. What will I have to oppose to those bad times? And the answer is this. And that's actually still happening. You have no idea how many of the things that you told me are things that actually we talked about with people, you know. It's like something that comes off from the ground, that comes off from the trees, you know. It's like we made different things, but actually we did the same.
Yeah.
So, and I really think that's absolutely wonderful. If there is anything to it that it's wonderful, it's this. Elementary and wonderful.